Hello everyone, welcome to our event where we'll be taking you through our newest white paper thinking, the social first brand. We'll just wait a couple more minutes before everybody can join and get set, so give us a few minutes. Great, so I think we can probably start to kick off and some more people might trickle through as we go, but welcome everyone. I'm Alex, Senior New Business Manager at Bourne, and I'm so excited to be hosting today's session. This white paper has been a rather long time coming for us. Some of you may know we released a white paper in 2018 called Brand Building on Social. That white paper did a great job of starting the conversation and making the case that brands really can be built on social. But since then, we've seen the industry move on. 2020 in particular, and I know we're all a bit sick of hearing it, but really did change things. Social, for the first time, became the centerpiece, relied upon in the absence of other channels, and with that, its credibility has really risen. Suddenly our vision of a social first kind of brand strategy didn't feel like a pipe dream anymore. It was becoming a reality. So here we are taking things up a notch as we present our newest white paper, the Social First Brand. So get set, Callum, our Executive Strategy Director and author, alongside Paddy Smith, our Executive Creative Director, will be taking you through the thinking over the next 40 minutes or so. And please feel free to ask questions through the Q&A function, and I'll get to some of those at the end. So with all of that kind of said, Cal, take it away.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone for joining. So this morning we're going to be running through our new white paper, the Social First Brand, Building Brilliant Brands in a Fragmented World. And as Alex said, this has been in the works for a long time. So yeah, personally super excited to get this out into the world and hear what everyone makes of it. And as Alex said, this is very much kind of a follow-up to brand building on social media. The white paper we released a few years ago, that started the conversation about how social should be used in the broader marketing mix, busting a few myths along the way, like why you shouldn't be focusing on followers and engagement if you're looking to grow your brand. Actually, social is the place to go broad at scale. Why you should be kind of approaching creative in a more kind of frameworky way, looking at fame builders, short stories, distinctive cues, rather than just posting to the feed, and why we should be measuring social in a much more kind of effective way, looking at how we're building emotional impact, being distinctive, building fame, and how well our media is performing in terms of frequency and cost and all that sort of thing. Measuring social in the way that really does kind of build brands. And I think, as Alex said, that initial piece of work did a really good job at essentially making the case for why social media can build brands, kind of tried to answer that question and kind of make that case. What we're really trying to do in this new white paper is take that on one more level, and really look at what are the new opportunities that our new environment gives us, and answer the question, how can social build better brands? What would happen if we kind of started from scratch and built up from here? What might that change in terms of how we think about brands in general? So that's what we're trying to answer here, and we think we've got a good point of view on that. And in doing so, I think it was really important that we tried to, I guess, resolve a bit of a dichotomy that we're seeing in the industry right now. On the one side, we've got the old school, those who believe that the laws of advertising are timeless, they don't and won't change, they're kind of static, they don't move. On the other side, you've got the new school, the world has changed and brands have to, the same old rules do not apply. And I think when we look at this, I think our overwhelming feeling is there's not enough people who are kind of sitting in the middle of these two things, taking those timeless truths and applying them in new, interesting ways, in new environments. And that's very much what we're trying to do with this thinking, is take what really works and apply it in new places. Take those timeless truths and apply them to new environments. And hopefully that will come through pretty strongly in what we're about to run through. And this is today's agenda. So we're first going to look at that new environment. So why do we believe that this is the time to be talking about this stuff? What has changed? Why is this important? Then we'll take a step back and look at those timeless truths, a lot of which you'll be familiar with. We're going to look at 4 truths and why they're under threat in today's environment. And then we're going to build that up into what we see as the framework for tomorrow's great brands. So 4 pillars. And we're going to dig into each one, loads of examples, loads of ways to get started, and put it together at the end. So we should be talking for 40 or so minutes to take you through the content. It's very much a whistle-stop tour of the white paper. There's going to be loads more in the white paper, which we'll be releasing later today. But we just wanted to kind of guide you through to make the most of that content. So let's crack on. Our new environment. What has changed? Before we do that, I think it was really important to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what we talk about when we talk about a brand. And, you know, there's so many different definitions of what a brand is, what that means. My favorite one comes from Stephen King, who wrote back in 1971, first, it has to be a coherent totality, not a lot of bits, the physical products, the pack, all the elements of communication, all must be blended into one single brand personality, which I think is a really accurate kind of representation of what a brand actually is. It's a coherent totality. But since Stephen King wrote that, we know that the world has changed massively. The internet has taken over traditional channels like TV as the dominant form of media consumption. And that has changed a lot for how brands come to life and how they're built. We've moved away from a broadcast kind of form of media. We take one clear message, one piece of comms, and get that out to as many people as possible in kind of one form, and move towards a network form of media where it really is many to many. Yes, what the brand says is important, but so is what everyone else says, and it's kind of much more fluid, decentralized, fragmented. This is the society that we live in today. And that has changed it all for brands. Whereas previously a brand, you know, you had control over all the individual parts of it, your price, your packaging, your promotions. You could kind of keep a good grip on all of it. The internet really has changed it all. The concept of brand has been smashed into millions of different fragments in terms of what you're saying on social, what your performance marketing is doing, what people are saying about you online, what influencers are saying, publishers, what your kind of TV ad is doing. It's all being kind of split into millions of different parts, many of which kind of have different priorities, different agendas. But the overwhelming thing is that there's now more parts than ever to the mix, and you've got less control over those parts than ever before. So many of these things just lie outside of the centralized brand's control, which is the big dilemma that I think needs to be solved to move forward. So this is the question we're basically trying to answer. How do we build strong, cohesive, memorable brands, that coherent totality in a distributed, decentralized and fragmented world? Like, if we can bring these two things together, I think that is what is going to characterize the great brands of tomorrow. Like, this is the big question. And to do that, we've basically taken a step back, as we did in brand building. What are those timeless truths, those things that do not change? How are they manifesting themselves at the moment? And what do we think is the route forward? What's our kind of new interpretation of that? And that's what we're going to use to build up those 4 pillars of Social First Brand. So recapping, because I'm sure you'll have seen a lot of stuff about these, but it's going to help to build up to these. Timeless truth number 1, brands need balance. We know that Binet and Field have done a load of great research into this over the years, and I think it's now become commonplace in the industry. This graph makes it into almost every deck, but we know that all brands need brand building, long-term kind of fame driving work, and they need sales activation, the more short-term, performance-driven, rational, trying to get an action now. All brands need both, but they need both in different doses. But the balance is really the thing that brands need to master. But we know that in today's world, there is almost a false dichotomy between long and short. So brand marketing and performance marketing are kind of butting heads, fighting for budget, fighting for priority. We've seen a swing towards short-termism that is guaranteed to only become more apparent as we head into the recession. And really these two forms of marketing are operating more separately than ever before. And there's a real struggle to get that balance. So we need a new solution here. Timeless truth number 2, we know that scale is fundamental. Marketing is pretty much just a numbers game. It's all about reaching as many people in your category as possible. Don't focus on just the heavy buyers. Get broad with your reach, get beyond the core. And this is what most brands still do get wrong with social media. They focus too much on the heavy buyers, the core audience, the followers, when actually we should be really trying to get as far beyond that as possible, reach as many people as possible. Marketing is a numbers game. But we know in today's world, attention is more fragmented than ever before. So I think, whereas in the past, you could kind of guarantee that scale by going to places like TV, for example. Now it's not so simple as that, because attention is fragmented across so many different devices, platforms, formats. There's no longer a one-stop solution to getting that scale, which is putting that under threat as well. Truth number 3, be consistently distinctive. We know that it is all around building mental availability. And one of the best ways to do that is by focusing on your distinctive assets, those mental shortcuts that kind of act as a link to the brand. And it's about being consistent with those assets and reinforcing them and building them over the long term. But today's world makes that harder than ever. And it's not just about what the brand says. It's not just about what's in the brand's control that matters anymore. Brands have been decentralized, and it's about what the people say as well. So how do you maintain consistency in your distinctiveness? How do you get those distinctive assets across when you're not in control of all your comms? Quite an interesting challenge. And truth number 4, strong brands are shared. So we know that brands can't exist on a one-to-one basis. We know that they have to exist within the collective understanding in society. I need to know what a brand stands for, and more importantly, I need to know that everyone else knows it too. Strong brands are kind of shared within culture. But again, we know that in today's world dominated by algorithms, the concept of culture has kind of been splintered into so many different fragments. What I'm being served on my feed or on my Netflix or my Spotify is going to be different to you. And that means that there's been a decline of that kind of shared understanding of what culture means. It's kind of been split into lots of different subcultures. And therefore it's harder for brands to identify what their place in culture is. So we take these 4 kind of truths. We need to balance long and short. Scale is fundamental. We need to be consistently distinctive. and we need to build that collective understanding. And we've basically looked at how do we think this can manifest in that new world, in that fragmented new environment. And this is our take. So balancing long and short becomes full funnel. So the way to balance long and short is by getting back control of the full funnel from top to bottom, from the first interaction to the last, and having a consistent, fluid, frictionless experience across the whole thing. Scale is fundamental becomes channel clusters. So rather than relying on one lead channel to get your scale, actually it's now about building clusters of complementary channels that all work together, and formats that kind of overlap and interact to kind of get that impact of multiple touch points, all working together towards the overall objective. Collective understanding becomes scaling subcultures. Social has kind of minimized the trade-off between subcultures and scale. It's given subcultures their scale. People are no longer restricted by geography. It's kind of social puts you in subcultures with people across the world with shared interests and beliefs. And we think it's about brands really going in deep on specific subcultures that really align with their brand identity and committing over the long term. We'll talk about how to do that. And finding consistent distinctiveness. How do you remain distinctive when you're not in control of anything anymore? Our solution here is around building with community, not just for them. It's around bringing the brand closer to the audience and the community, and kind of bringing them much closer together rather than seeing them as two separate things. That's how we could get closer to distinctiveness. And when looking at these four pillars, this is when we start to make the case for why social should sit at the heart of the marketing approach for the brands of tomorrow. Social is the place where you can genuinely bring together brand and performance across both objectives from top to bottom of that funnel. Social is just basically a collection of lots of different platforms and formats that work together. So channel clusters. Social is the place that has given subcultures their scale. It has enabled that to be not a trade-off for brands. And finally, it's obviously the place where communities have been born and nurtured, live and breathe. It's where that plays out. So I think when we look at these four new interpretations, it really does start to make the case for why social should sit at the heart of a brand's kind of approach, rather than just a supplementary channel at the end of the process. So that's where we're at. And what we're going to do now is basically take you through each of those pillars. So start off full funnel. And I'm just going to go through, I guess, three starting points, kind of three things to consider for each area. And then Paddy is going to talk through a case study that starts to bring it to life and show how you could start implementing this stuff. So we'll start with full funnel. This is our kind of interpretation of how to achieve that balance, how to bring together long and short and stop them operating so differently. It's about gaining back control of the full funnel from top to bottom and ensuring one consistent identity and approach across the whole thing. And our first kind of action point here is around almost a hybrid mindset between brand and performance. I think when you look at the way the industry is structured at the moment, brand marketers and performance marketers are almost seen as completely different. Whereas I think if we play more in the middle ground between these two approaches, I think there's lots of benefits and lots of things that we could explore, which I think are quite interesting. So things like test and scale. So obviously performance marketing is characterized by rigorous, hard split testing and A/B testing to find the winning variation. Whereas brand marketing is characterized by scale and going hard with your one winning piece of creative. So I think we could combine these two approaches in a much better way, with a kind of test hard and then scale hard with the one winner, which would help us to bring together these two approaches in a better way. Feedback loops. So again, I think brand marketing, often we kind of pick our one piece of creative and stick with that for the long term. I think we could get much better at baking in feedback loops to that process so that we can iterate over time. and most importantly, balanced scorecards. I think our ability to resolve this divide between brand and performance really relies on rigorous and strong approaches to measurement. I think balanced scorecards are the way to do that. So making sure that short-term and long-term effects are feeding into the same framework, and they're both accountable and they're both in balance. I think that is the biggest thing that we can do to start to make these two approaches accountable to each other. Secondly, direct to consumer. So we know that in 2020, almost every retail business became an e-commerce business overnight through necessity. I think it's our opinion that this isn't something that is going to simply revert back to how it was pre-pandemic. I think when we look at the brands of tomorrow and that full funnel approach, I think having some kind of direct offering becomes really important in terms of joining up that funnel. So at the moment, we see a lot of brands having really broken customer journeys. So they might be able to kind of see how they're performing on the brand metrics, but actually that conversion stage is really hidden from them. And some kind of direct offering can really help to kind of bring that together, give you that visibility, gives you more control and consistency across the whole funnel. You really are kind of in charge of that whole thing, and you're not outsourcing your brand to other touch points. And I think there's definitely a range of different models here. What we're not saying is that every business needs to be full D2C. That's not advisable. It'd be naive to say that. But I think there are different models that brands can adapt to start dipping their toes into the D2C offering. Look at how KFC have entered with kind of a merch setup, Heinz looking at bundles, Pepsi doing the same thing. I think it's something interesting to explore that can start to join up that journey in a really good way. And finally, on this area, I think social commerce is a really good thing to think about. So social commerce has been just around the corner for years now. Like, I think it's been in every trends deck for probably the last 5 years. But I think now we're seeing that it is really starting to pick up some speed. It's obviously in the direction of travel for all of the social platforms. Even just looking at the redesign of the Instagram app, they've got shop front and center. I think we see that reflected across all of the apps. So TikTok with their partnership with Shopify, Snapchat baking in this kind of AR product discoverability. All of the platforms are moving towards this, and it's going to be a good move, I think, because it starts to reduce the friction. Between social and commerce. It starts to kind of bring together that journey. But I think most importantly, it could be the thing that starts to help marry up long-term brand and short-term sales. There's always been the kind of assumption that you can't really do both at once. And I think in the majority of cases that is true. But I do wonder if social commerce could start to minimize that trade-off. For instance, having shoppable tags on a fame-driving piece of creative, I think you could start to minimize that trade-off and really marry the two together in interesting ways. So that's our 3 kind of starting points for full funnel. We need to get back control from top to bottom, and that involves this hybrid brand and performance mindset rather than seeing them as 2 separate things. Starting a direct consumer offering and kind of leaning into that, and really leaning into social commerce tools and functionality to start stitching those 2 things together. And Paddy's going to take us through an example.
Yeah, cheers, Cal. Morning, everyone. So a brand that we kind of keep coming back to when we think about full funnel approach on social, but also a brand that feels like it is consciously focusing on closing that gap between the performance and brand work they're doing is Rafa, which you can see here. I suppose one thing you might expect to see when you pull together a body of creative work that spans that full funnel is that it would end up looking quite varied, potentially scattered, and it might be noticeable which creative is trying to do which job. The creative at the top of the funnel would likely feel more engaging, more exciting, potentially more crafted, and have a tone and copy that feels more on brand and true to that brand, whereas the bottom of the funnel might feel slightly more cold, more calculated, and have a tone and aesthetic that feels more direct and more specific. It would almost feel like there are 2 different brands on that one page. And I often think there is a feeling that there has to be a compromise on creativity and on craft in order to do that well, but I don't actually think that's necessarily true. And I think that Rafa is a really good example of that. Because the first thing you can see when you look at them as a whole, it is one clear, consistent brand. They work really hard to tie all their creative together, regardless of that objective or that desired action. It is all on brand and feels really high creative standard and a high level of craft as well. They properly focus on bringing together the product specific messaging they have, but also the brand stories and narratives together. So they consistently weave those into each other in the production they make, in the stories they tell, in the products, and how they focus on those products in brand activations, talent partnerships, and ambassador work as well. It really does seem like they are focusing on bringing together what their beliefs are as a brand, but also what they make and fusing them really, really closely together. So as Cal said, they also then seamlessly integrate the social commerce tools and elements like shoppable tags, which reduces that friction, creates a really seamless process of discovery of the brand, understanding who they are and liking them all the way through to purchase. So yeah, a really good example of a brand embracing that full funnel approach, but more so focusing on removing that compromise between the brand work and the performance work they're doing.
Yeah, fantastic. So next one of our pillars is channel clusters. So this is about how do we maintain that approach to scale, knowing that marketing is a numbers game, when there's no longer one kind of one-stop shop approach to scale. I think our kind of take on this is that we need to move away from kind of one lead channel and lots of supplementary ones. It's about kind of leaning into a much more flexible approach to channels and formats, kind of developing clusters of platforms that work together to achieve objectives. And that has some interesting kind of implications for creativity. First up, we know that platform diversity is a good thing. It's not a compromise. We know that kind of reaching people across different platforms has been shown to increase ROI. It's got that kind of greater than the sum of its parts impact. This is nothing new. People like Ritson have been talking for years about the kind of the benefits of an integrated approach. What I think is new is the sheer kind of proliferation of new platforms, formats, places to reach people that have really cropped up over the last few years. We're seeing almost a second wave of social apps really taking off at the moment. Just look at the rise of TikTok. I think it's easier than ever for brands to really lean into this approach and diversify their mix in a way that it would have been tougher before. But I think when we do that, we have to be really conscious that the context becomes as important as the craft itself, because we're moving away from kind of one set format towards lots of different formats and behaviors. It really is important to marry those two things up. So thinking about format and thinking about the mindset of users on that platform and the behaviors, how people use those particular platforms. TikTok used the line, "Don't make ads, make TikToks," to promote their business offering. Whether you agree with that or not, I think it does speak to that kind of that truth that someone watching a vertical video on TikTok is going to be expecting something fundamentally different from a vertical video on Instagram stories, kind of the same technical format, but it can be more different in terms of mindset and behavior. That's why brands have to have a super and to be super considered in how they're thinking about the context as much as the craft. The New York Public Library example, bottom right, is just a great example of that. It's bringing together the context and the craft, and kind of the mashup of those two things creates a really good piece of work. So I think this is about smashing silos. It's about bringing media and creative much closer together, and really coming up with new creative ways to get messaging across. And finally, I think this also has interesting implications for how we think about creativity and how ideas are kind of communicated. I think the channel cluster approach allows us to move beyond just one hero asset, potentially with some cut downs to communicate a message. I think we can move towards and need to move towards more flexible suites of assets that can be deployed in different places, in different formats, different channels, all of which kind of convey the same message, but in a much more flexible way, built for different platforms. I think this also opens up kind of interesting options for narratives, can riff and extend across multiple pieces of creative across multiple platforms in ways that you just couldn't do so in one piece of creative. So I think this is where we need to move to, away from just one hero asset towards more flexible, always on ecosystems of creative. So that's channel clusters. We think it's really important to lean into platform diversity. That means that craft becomes as important as the context, and moving towards these more always on ecosystems of creative.
Yeah, nice. One of the best, I think, specific examples of this notion of channel clusters in practice last year was done by Burberry, and specifically how they applied this theory to the launch of their brilliant, potentially the best of last year, the Singing in the Rain Christmas campaign that they launched back in November. I'm sure you remember seeing this long form launch hero asset, the immaculately dressed models frolicking down Brick Lane in East London, creatively avoiding what is actually quite a terrifying hailstorm. Really enjoyable bit of creative, like sheer joy, super uplifting, but still feels super high end, like a real testament to Burberry's creative direction. But what I think is interesting is they didn't just leave that there. They, rather than relying solely on that hero asset and that launch asset to do all of the impacts, they really did develop this super comprehensive ecosystem around it to build out that creative narrative in full and take it beyond that of just the launch. So it spanned YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, IGTV, stories, press, influencers, the works, multiple different platforms, multiple different formats, but all really consciously crafting that idea back to the context of each platform and what works well on there, and allowing that to let the idea live beyond just that launch, that initial kickoff. And then they also went on to create this almost this series of spin-offs based around the individual cast members that are involved in it and exploring them in more detail, which is again extending that narrative, but again constantly sort of backs up their broader commitment as a brand to youth culture and creativity. Yeah, so really nice example of the ecosystem.
Yeah, great. Definitely the best Christmas ad this year.
100%.
Third up, build a community. So how do we ensure consistent distinctiveness when so much of what a brand is now stands outside of the control of the brand? I think this is about viewing community, your audience, on the same level as the centralized brand. We need to bring those two things together rather than kind of running with just a top-down approach to branding. And our first recommendation here is around distinctive assets. So we all know that distinctive brand assets are really important to be consistent across all of your touch points as a brand. I think when we think about this, we thought in today's world, actually, we need to be focusing on distinctive product assets. So they're brand assets that are kind of evident on the product itself. So the Glossier pink pouch, Starbucks cups, the Rafa stripes, all things that are evident on the product itself, but also feature quite heavily in the communications from the brand. And in doing that, you kind of bring together what the community is saying and what the brand is saying, that they become one and the same. So it's around focusing on the assets that are kind of evident in the product. People will want to share them, and that being the thing that can tie the two together. So I think this is a really important kind of thing to be focusing on, bringing together what the brand says, what the community say. Second, it's about creators and curators. So you know, influencers often get a bad reputation in marketing because they're often seen as kind of short-term, tactical, separate to the brand strategy, and potentially not measured in the right way. But I think it's kind of important to recognise that I think they are going to have and already do have a huge role to play in the building of social first brands, tomorrow's brands, because the creator economy really is, you know, they do kind of literally run the internet. I think brands need to lean into that more in order to access that. It's about becoming much more meaningful in how you work with them. So rather than just kind of working with creators and curators on short-term partnerships to kind of hold up the product, it's around long-term partnerships, working with them to take the brand idea, take the distinctive product assets, interpret them in new ways. I think we're starting to see some really interesting kind of riffs on this, where they're bringing creators and curators right into the heart of the brand to do some interesting work. So I think it's around taking a much more meaningful approach to creators and curators, and investing much more long-term partnerships here. And finally, co-creation, recognise a bit of a buzzword within marketing and advertising, but I think it's actually there's something really important in it in terms of bringing community closer to the centralised brand. This is about getting beyond the broadcast. So it's not just about putting out one message to your audience and not getting anything back. It's about working with audiences to develop new ideas, new creative, new possibilities. It's no longer a gimmick. I think this is really important to note. This is going to become kind of such an important part of tomorrow's brands, and it's not about just kind of asking people to comment on your post, vote on things. It's about taking this much more upstream and getting much more serious about how you do this. And in doing so, you can remove the friction between your community and your brand and kind of bring them together in a much better way. So loads of examples on the right of how this is done. Just look at how TikTok is starting to develop as a platform. It's all around co-creation, taking something and riffing and extending and working together to make something better. I think brands need to really play into this rather than existing kind of just in a centralized way. So building with community, it's our approach to kind of trying to get closer to distinctiveness across all touch points, even when you're not in control of all of them. So distinctive product assets, creators and curators, and co-creation being the starting points for that.
Yeah, and Glossier is probably the perfect example of a brand that's embodied that community-first approach and had that ingrained in them since the very beginning. So founded by Emily Weiss, built out of her beauty blog, which was called Into the Gloss. The brand itself was almost created out of the observations and understanding that demand and frustration that her community from that blog had with the beauty world, how it stood, how it looked, that feeling of it being unrealistic and unachievable. So quite literally the brand built out of what those people were saying, not a gimmick that was added in kind of later down the line. And they were quite literally, and do on social, consistently ask their audience what is lacking from their lives, from their beauty routine, and then give it back to them in content or in products themselves. So really creating that sense of co-ownership and co-creation, actually impacting the brand itself. And then they're probably the case study best for identifying that opportunity to build really distinctive product assets, almost designing the brand with user-generated content in mind. The unmistakable pastel pink, the trademark pink pouches that Cal alluded to earlier, even sets of stickers they deliver to you so you can personalize all the products yourselves. It feels like it's all designed to kind of egg on and promote their audience, to promote on their behalf and share their brand on their behalf. And it's that kind of commitment to distinction that's meant that the majority of their user-generated content feels super aligned with what their brand aesthetic is. And if you step back, it actually feels really hard to distinguish between what is community content and what is brand content, which is pretty incredible. And then I think beyond that, they've kind of shown that commitment as they've scaled and become this cult icon in the beauty world. They've not lent on huge celebrity endorsements to do the heavy lifting for them. They've committed to this idea of what they say, making everyone an influencer. So really focusing on the people in their community. They've even led large scale campaigns with user generated content, like the face mask on the left in the bath, the glass of wine, which is the reality of how that product is used. And yeah, ultimately lent into and chose to promote and hero those people who have made them a success and kind of built their brand alongside them. So yeah, really unwavering commitment from them to community. And that's what I think has cemented them as this icon in the beauty world, but has built that truly die-hard community around them.
Yeah, great. I just recently read that they've been able to trademark that pink pouch, despite it not having a logo or anything on it. Just such a good example of a distinctive product asset that is kind of audience first rather than brand first. Finally, scaling subcultures. So this is about brands need to occupy some kind of a space in culture. Like that's how they build that shared understanding. But we know that culture has splintered into loads of different niches, different subcultures, and social has been the kind of driving force in doing that. And we think that brands need to basically lean into that and redefine what they see as culture, and how they therefore start to kind of integrate that into their approach. This is about identifying subcultures that have a natural fit with the brand. They should both have kind of a shared ambition, shared values, shared beliefs. So it's about identifying the right subcultures for your brand, and kind of really doing a good amount of thinking about what that is, because you're going to commit over the long term. This isn't about dipping in and out of different subcultures on the chase for kind of quick hits of reactive success. This is about really committing for the long term, and kind of really incorporating this into your overall strategy. I think when done right, this should have a really clear overlap with your kind of the targeting that you're using, the target audience that you're going for. They should really become one and the same. If your goal is to build that collective understanding amongst your target audience, you have to be kind of going for subcultures that kind of overlap a lot with that. So that should really they should come together in a really good way. Second is cultural codes. So cultural codes are the kind of the shared language, the way that a subculture kind of interacts and lives, and the context and the in-jokes, all that stuff that if you don't do your homework on and you don't understand, that's when you're going to get silence brand. So it's about kind of really doing your listening, doing your homework, really understanding the nuance, the in-jokes, how a subculture kind of live and organize themselves, and getting that right before you start trying to make some kind of an impact there, start adding value in different ways. I think you really have to kind of nail that. And from the off, I think these examples on the right are all great examples of brands that have really kind of adopted those cultural codes. They clearly get it. And when you do that, it removes the friction between the way you're speaking and the way the subculture operates. You have to get that right. And then when you do, it's all around adding value in some way to that subculture. So again, what brands often get wrong is they're trying to just kind of extract value from it. They're trying to use it as a marketing technique. Really, this is about figuring out ways to add value to those subcultures. So a couple of ideas: flashpoints. These are the big moments that happen, the kind of moments that get everyone talking. How can you offer some kind of a opinion, a take, a view on that at the time? Structures, giving subcultures ways to organize themselves, things to kind of do. Stream Aid, really good example of that. And causes, things that brands can get behind that will be aligned with the subculture. So you know, brands have one thing that others don't, which is scale and advertising budgets. That's what gives them their scale. So putting that behind the right causes can really help to add value in good ways. So scaling subcultures, it's no longer about trying to get into a space in monoculture. It's about identifying and committing to set subcultures that really do align with the brand. It's about really understanding those cultural codes and kind of adopting that into the tone and nuance, and adding value in good and interesting ways.
So your last, but certainly not least, brand that potentially best embodies this notion of committing to subcultures is Netflix, as Cal calls them, the poster child of social media strategy, but for good reason. So they, as a brand, they know how instrumental they've been in defining and shaping modern culture, modern pop culture, but rather than viewing their entire audience as one homogenous group who are connected through entertainment, they actually recognize that broad viewership is made up of much smaller subsets of groups of individuals and communities within them who have those specific and shared interests. So they almost build out these pods of fandoms based on their specific likes and dislikes. And because of the prevalence of subcultures in that entertainment fandom, they've doubled down on that strategy. So they've done things like starting separate social accounts with specific teams, actual teams of fans themselves who understand those subcultures well and how to speak to that audience. And they've plugged those teams into fandoms built around the films and the shows that they have. So The Crown, Emily in Paris, Irishman, but they've also then committed to slightly broader subcultures like Netflix and food. They've got NX and Netflix, which is their home of the geek, and then Netflix and family as well. I think what's interesting is they have, as a brand, what is a really solid and clear understanding of the cultural codes that they are associated with. So everything from their tone of voice through their overall aesthetic is built with that fandom in mind and playing to best practice in that. And because of all of that, they as a brand then are really confident of knowing when to pivot back to those flashpoints, those moments in culture and reactive opportunities, and then know how to tap into the universal truths they have about their brand and their products and the world around them. And that allows them to become part of that inside joke really seamlessly. And then above all, to Cal's point, the best thing they do is they are really adding value back to those subcultures rather than simply poaching the value from it. They're actually giving those people structures and a place to organize their thoughts and come together, and then sharing them content that is genuinely interesting and bringing them closer together. So yeah, really good example.
Great. So we've just been down 4 rabbit holes, and yeah, so they're going to have a lot more detail in the white paper itself, which you'll be able to look at. But I was conscious that I think it's quite important to pull it all together now and give you a look at how it all kind of works together, because I think the big thing I want to get across is this shouldn't be seen as 4 kind of standalone tactics. I think you will have picked up from the way that we've been showing the examples. Actually, there's so much overlap between the 4 areas, and when you kind of commit to all 4, that's when you start to see a real compounding return and interesting kind of mashups between different bits. So I think it's all around pulling it together into one approach being really important. When we were thinking about how to do that, there's one brand that really stood out as being a kind of someone that's really tried and tested that approach, and that's Gymshark. I think Gymshark are a really interesting example because they have indisputably built their brand with a social first approach. That is kind of how they have done it. But I think they also have the kind of the commercial results to back up the kind of effectiveness of that approach, and now valued at over £1 billion. I think a lot of it is down to how they have gone about doing that in a really social first way. So I think just to articulate that, they are masters of this full funnel approach. So they have one clear, consistent identity across brand, performance. It kind of all does kind of blend into one. Look at their Black Friday campaign is a really good example of that. Most Black Friday comms you see are not the most kind of creative campaigns. It's a pure rational drive to website. They kind of didn't compromise on creativity with that campaign. They got across an interesting narrative that drew people in, but also has that rational call to action. They go all in on social commerce using things like shoppable tags to reduce the friction, and obviously they sell direct. They're huge ambassadors of the channel clustered approach. They call it platform first. So if you look across all of their different channels, it's clear that there's one clear brand across them all. There's one clear message they're trying to get across, but they communicate that in ways that really get the context of each platform. And so using kind of very TikTok first kind of creative on that platform, using native features like Facebook events, using text only tweets on Twitter, all kind of adds to the overall brand identity, but they kind of go really hard on crafting and context. Scaling subcultures, they're super committed to the gym subculture, and within that, personal trainers as well, almost at the top of that pyramid, and consistently reacting to flashpoints like when the gyms shut. They were kind of straight in with that. They offered an hourly rate to personal trainers that were struggling for work to host online workouts, kind of adding value in that way. In campaigns like their Sweaty Selfies campaign to raise money. Again, really good ways of giving their scale behind causes. And finally, they're huge ambassadors of building with community. So things like Facebook groups, providing structures for communities to organise, working with, they call them Gymshark athletes. They're ambassadors on long-term partnerships to develop content series, things like that, like running tips, and distinctive products assets coming through super strongly. So over 9 million pieces of UGC on the Gymshark hashtag, each of which has that distinctive product asset, the logo on the t-shirt, getting that across really strongly and making sure there's consistency between what the brand is saying and what the people are saying, which has worked incredibly well for them. So Gymshark are a great example of this, really adopting that approach and improving the kind of, when it works together, that's when you really start to see the results. And we think that's really the route forwards. So just to summarize, the 4 parts of the social first brand. So first off, full funnel. It's about bringing together brand and performance by unlocking the full funnel from top to bottom. Channel clusters. It's about achieving scale through layers by building clusters of channels rather than any one lead channel. Build a community. It's about ensuring consistent distinctiveness by building with your community, not just for them. and scaling subcultures. So it's about building collective understanding by committing to subcultures rather than getting into monoculture. And when you pull these four things together, when you adopt the approach, that's where we see the social first brand really coming to the fore and making the argument for why social should sit at the heart of the brands of tomorrow. So I'm going to leave it there. Really excited to share the white paper with everyone shortly, so you can start kind of getting into more detail in each of them and start to see what you make of it. But hopefully that was a good rundown of our thinking and starting to make the case for it.
Great, thank you so much, Paddy and Cal, for running us through. We now have some questions, a bit of time to answer those. So I've been going through the Q&A, lots of good conversation. So we'll kick off with the first one, which is probably best for you, Cal. It's around how we measure success. What benchmarks should we be looking at?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think full funnel is the kind of the pillar that really should be driving what success looks like. It's about that balanced scorecard. So it's about feeding in long-term and short-term effects to the same, being responsible for the same thing. So long-term, how well is the brand building metrics moving? So things like emotion, fame, are we being known for the right things? Are we building that collective understanding? And then on the short-term effects, how well are we converting at that bottom stage of the funnel? What role are the different platforms playing in that? And making sure they're both feeding into the same kind of overall framework, I think is important.
Great, thank you. And one for you, Paddy, around look and feel. So in such a kind of saturated environment, especially on social, the examples that we gave really show brands that have their own distinctive look and feel. How do other brands replicate that and make themselves distinctive in such a saturated environment?
Yeah, okay. So I think the way in which brands fundamentally become distinctive and stand out is by doing what's best for each of those platforms. I know they have different visual codes almost, but actually by doing what is fundamentally best for that platform based on the behaviors, the trends, the formats, best practice, that's how they stand out. And their job is to think about how they can actually add the brand in a more seamless and secondary way, actually figure out creatively, how do I get the brand in here without overwhelming what is best for the platform? So if you think about, I think Chipotle were in there, they actually understand what's best for each platform and then put themselves in there. So for Instagram, it's more of a food feature or meme feature. But for TikTok, you know, it's people-led and skit-led, so it's more of a staff focus, but still the brand is in there. They even go to things like merchandise on Depop and understand how they can get their brand in there creatively. Twitter is inside jokes and references and almost this like idea of a staff tweeting. So what they've done is understand what is the way to stand out on each platform, and then how can I actually creatively put my brand in that.
Perfect, thank you. Callum, over to you. We've got a question around for smaller brands. Should be focusing on first. What does that look like?
Sorry, I missed it. Was that about which pillar they should be focusing on first? Where to start?
With brands who have smaller budgets, yeah. Where should the focus lie?
Yeah, great. So I think it's interesting about that in reference to channel clusters, particularly. So that is definitely a balance of, obviously you don't want to spread your budget too thin, but you do want to be kind of maximizing that effect. So I think it's very much a balancing act there. I think it's really in the interaction between the four bits. So the big idea is still crucial. And I think a big idea that can cut through on a smaller budget is really the things to focus on. And then think about the four pillars as almost tactics for getting that across. So how can we make that big idea work across both long-term and short-term objectives? How can we bring in community in that? How can we make that culturally relevant to a particular subculture? How can we kind of bring that to life across multiple platforms? I think focus on getting that idea right, and then using the four as kind of tactics to get it across is probably the good way to start.
Great, thank you. Well, 5-2, so we're gonna wrap up there. But Thank you everyone so much for joining. Worth saying that we will be sending across the white paper, as Callum mentioned, in full later today, alongside a recording of this session for you all as well. So please do share with teams if relevant. Keep an eye on your inbox. And also worth mentioning that this is the first of 5 events in our Social First Brand series. So each event, we're going to be deep diving into each pillar in more detail. So again, kind of keep your eyes out for an invite. But that's it from us. Thank you all again for coming, and any questions, please just let us know, hit us up via shout@bornsocial.co.uk. Thank you. Bye.
Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.